I think the starting point would for you to explain what the Restrict Act is.
Sure. So the Restrict Act has been introduced just in the Senate, but I think it's important to note from the outset that despite all the criticisms, it has 26 senators who have already signed on as co-sponsors of the bill, bipartisan. So that's very significant because there's only 100 senators, so you have 26% of the entire Senate that's agreeing with this bill and willing to put their name on it. What the Restrict Act does is it gives powers to the Secretary of Commerce, and it allows the Commerce Secretary to determine if there is a quote-unquote critical infrastructure, which is a term that was coined under the Patriot Act in 2001 after 9/11, a critical infrastructure that could be subverted or used by foreign adversaries in a way that would disrupt or potentially threaten the national security of the United States. So this is not a new concept as to what the Commerce Secretary should do. Think about it a lot in terms of the framework that we've had before and talked about with Bitcoin in terms of sanctions. Sanctions comes from the Department of Treasury, which is the OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control. And what OFAC does is they stop either individual persons or they talk about countries in terms of where an entire country might be a particular threat. What the Commerce Secretary could do under this bill is let's talk about TikTok, because that was the framework that it was sort of provided in. TikTok is owned, a majority-controlled owner, 50% or more, by China. So China's one of the... Yes.
Sorry to interject here, but isn't it that all companies in China are 50% owned by the government?
That all of them in China...
I'm pretty sure it's like 50% of... Not 50% of companies. Companies are 50% owned by the government. That's like a regulatory requirement. Is that true? Do we know that?
I don't know. I don't believe so, but...
I don't know. And I should say the bill makes it clear it could be the country. It could be a company that's clearly controlled by the company. You know, like in other words, somebody who's running that company that's controlled by China. But either which way, let's just say TikTok is either controlled by an individual who's controlled by China or China itself. It could be China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and North Korea. So those are the 6 countries under this Restrict Act.
That's all those countries that, like, when I go into America, you have to tick if you've been to any of those countries.
Yeah, right. Have you been? Yeah. Exactly. And so it's a new paradigm because remember, with the Restrict Act, the acronym, which I don't remember completely, but the ICT is Information Communications and Technology. So where does that bring us to in terms of Bitcoin and the threat to really anything that's on the internet? To me, Peter, this is a really interesting point in our civilization because if you take a step back and think about this from a broad perspective, there's a new battlefield, and the battlefield is almost this cyber warfare, right? We're talking about whether there's hacks, right? There could be ransomware. China shut off the internet initially when it came out, right? So we've almost now come full circle where we at America are saying, well, if something's being developed by China that's just purely over the internet, is that something that's a threat to the United States? So that to me is a very interesting paradigm to think about this, that the U.S. is now at least thinking, gee, there could be a threat if somebody or China itself owns an app like TikTok and could cause enough disruption in the United States, maybe swing an election, whatever, with the influence that it has.
I mean, it is a real threat. And look, I am a big proponent of free speech, but we recently just interviewed a chap called Ahmed Gatnash. And he works for a human rights organization who's trying to progress human rights in the Middle East. And he talked a lot about Arabic Twitter and the conversations that happen in Arabic Twitter. And there's a mass dissemination of propaganda that comes from authoritarian states who disagree with the context of the conversations. And he said that's basically made Arabic Twitter unusable. And that ultimately led to a conversation that we ended up having about Pegasus and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. But this is this is the real threat of what's being disrupted.
Yes. If you go back, let's go back for a second to Tornado Cash. Remember, with Tornado Cash, it's people should be able to move in their Bitcoin and move it out and stay anonymous, right? And anonymity is something that's an American value to one degree or another. The Federalist Papers, you mentioned at the beginning of the show, was written under anonymous pseudonames to help create all that. So that's an important thing. But when you have the this concept that you could be influenced or that Bitcoin might be used by another country to do something. So in the example of the Tornado Cash, it was pretty clear North Korea was using money, washing it through Tornado Cash, and then buying nuclear weapons. And there's been pretty direct evidence that a lot of that is happening. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, we want the benefit of anonymity. I don't want to know your business financially. You don't want me to know your business, vice versa, right? That's a respected, almost universal truth. But at the same time, we have this world where everything's online, right? So how do we also protect to make sure that we don't end up living under North Korean rule because they're able to figure out how to get so much of the Bitcoin and do so much funding? And I don't know the answers. This is the setting for where I think you see things like the Restrict Act come into fruition. Because I think right now people are just guessing at, hey, what's the solution? Maybe just ban it. Maybe just shut it off.
Well, I always find the people have the most simple takes as the most naive and almost the difficult ones to deal with. When I'm ever having a conversation on Twitter and somebody comes in with this super binary simple take, I actually find it quite naive. And look, the thing is, it doesn't matter whether I am a proponent of democracy or not, or I agree with government or not. These are complicated issues. We know this. There are dangerous people. There are adversaries out there. They are trying to disrupt democracy. They are trying to spread disinformation. We know this is happening. And so this is where I want to focus my attention on is not what is the Patriot Act or the Restrict Act, is how is it going to be weaponized against Americans? Because we know the Patriot Act was and has been weaponized against Americans, and we know that the Restrict Act will also be weaponized against Americans. And to me, that is just antithetical to what democracy is.
Yes. And I'll tell you, there's a division in Congress about the Restrict Act. Some have said it's gone too far. If we go to the idea of how the Restrict Act might actually shut off Bitcoin, this is a notion of like shutting off TikTok, not an individual user of TikTok. So it empowers the Secretary of Commerce to sit back and say, like you just talked about in the first part of what you were saying, is there are all these threats out there and we need to shut it down. So we got to keep them out. Maybe there's some people in America that like using TikTok and they share cat videos, but you know what? We'll leave that to YouTube and everything else. This is something that has to be done for national security because they might swing an election. Bitcoin, same premise of it's not me sending you Bitcoin, but it could be said that maybe North Korea or China is using Bitcoin so well or so good that in America, the Secretary of Commerce could say, I'm shutting off the Bitcoin protocol, meaning no one in America is allowed to use Bitcoin, the network, not necessarily hold Bitcoin, but just you can't use the network anymore, which by default means we probably couldn't send it via Bitcoin, and it would probably be written to ban Lightning as well, even though it would be off chain. And so that brings you to a question, right? Of again, like I'm laughing because I'm just thinking of the enormity of this, of where we went from China to not using the internet to shut everyone else out to now here we are saying, well, the U.S. can't use certain things on the internet because of what China might do.
And it's an ironic flip.
And I think that there has to be a different type of, so it's very broad. That's the problem with the Restrict Act. Other people have been talking about something called the Data Act as an alternative that just focuses on the privacy. In other words, how your privacy might be deprived by TikTok, not necessarily a national security angle. People are talking about that more. But the problem with the Restrict Act is it's so broad it could include Bitcoin. And to me, I think Bitcoin needs to be something separate from the rest of the internet because of the value that it proposes and because it works like money. I recently in a Twitter thread, it had been mentioned that Natalie Smolensky and I had written this sort of resolution for Bitcoin in the state of Texas. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Fantastic. And I wrote the first draft, but it would not have gone as far as it would have without Natalie, because now it's actually up for potential voting. And the whole idea of that is that there has to be certain protections for people who have Bitcoin in the United States. And I believe that at some point we're going to need some sort of constitutional amendment to do that, because you're talking about not just the right to privacy, but the right to property. You're owning something. What does that mean? The ability to mine Bitcoin, but
encoded speech.
Encoded speech. Yeah, all these things, the ability, to be able to have the imagination do what you want to do. So Bitcoin's a little bit unique. And I say that to illustrate how the Restrict Act in this case is so broad that it could include anything. And that goes to the second point of what you just said, Peter, which is that's the threat of it, right? We're trying to stop the national security issue, but are we then just taking everyone else's, privacy away? And that's the threat of it, right? We're trying to stop the national security issue, but are we then just taking everyone else's, privacy away? And that's the threat of it, right? We're trying to stop the national security issue, but are we then just taking everyone else's could it later someone with malintent who takes over the government use the Restrict Act to shut down certain activities that they don't like in the US?
I think there's also like a massive hypocrisy in it, because we know Cambridge Analytica interfered with elections using Facebook. And if it's a US domiciled social media network, they don't seem to care. But now it's China, that's sort of like, and I understand like it's a kind of thinly veiled surveillance tool. But do you think this would have happened if it was a US social media platform?
Not a bill like this.
But they can haul them from Congress.
True.
Yeah, there's much more, right? Like think about how a lot of people in Congress literally hate Facebook and accuse them of issues relating to child sex trafficking and others creating the forms. I mean, they have to answer to Congress directly. So that is, something. And, the irony I can't help but of Cambridge Analytica being from England. So no,
But there is a big difference between TikTok and Bitcoin, though, in that when they ban Huawei or if they ban TikTok, what they're really doing is stopping surveillance, because they are tools which are owned by China. And therefore, when people are using TikTok and making a cat video or a dance video or something, Congress is doing that, that is a surveillance tool that sends data directly back to China. But if they ban Bitcoin, they're not actually stopping data going back to China. So what they're really only doing is banning Americans from using Bitcoin. They're not harming the network. They're not changing how the network works. They're just really harming Americans.
And Americans would probably still be using it. Let's be honest. I mean, so yeah, they would just be harming U.S. individuals.